From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. I owe you a word of explanation. We had some technical difficulties. For those of you on radio, that's why you're hearing some music. For the rest of you on television, you just got to see some charts for a bit. But now we're off and running. The first presidential debate takes place in this key swing state of Ohio tonight. And our chief Washington correspondent, Kevin Cirilli, is on the scene in Cleveland. So, Kevin, great to have you there. I know you'll be there right through the debate tonight. Before we get into the substance of what might be discussed tonight, set the stage for us. Who's going to be there? What kind of arena is it? What are the rules that the moderator, Chris Wallace, is going to have to try to enforce?
90 minutes uninterrupted, the first time that Joe Biden and President Trump will go head to head, and both are giving some clues about their strategies for this evening based upon who they are surrounding themselves with. Now, there's no spin room giving the social distance guidelines of Ohio and, of course, around the country. But here's what I can tell you. Congressman Tim Ryan, a centrist Democrat, and Congressman Connor Lamb, another centrist Democrat in battleground states, Ohio and Pennsylvania, are going to be with Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden. And meanwhile, we're learning that some conservatives in the far right movement of the party are also going to be with President Trump. People like Senator Marsha Blackburn, a Republican from Tennessee, one of the key members of the Senate Judiciary Committee, of course, that will take up the nomination of Judge Amy Coney Barrett, as well as Congressman Jim Jordan, another ultra-conservative in the Freedom Caucus, someone who has deep political ties to the president's chief of staff, Mark Meadows, in terms of negotiating on that fiscal stimulus. So we're gathering about the strategies here as Biden tries to make a play for centrists and President Trump tries to rally that working class base.
That's fascinating, Kevin. I had not known that before. You just told it to me, because if we read into any that, and I'm not sure how much we can read in, that means the whole debate is shifting toward the right. That is to say, the former Vice President Joe Biden is really going toward the center, and it's no coincidence you have Connor Lamb, who's just across the border, really near Pittsburgh. You've got Tim Ryan as well. There's a really centrist Democrats, and then the Republicans are going to the right. That might suggest where the whole debate is shifting.
Precisely. And we're also gathering that after the debate, Biden is going to be embarking on an Ohio-Pennsylvania train tour. Of course, he has a storied history with Amtrak in terms of traveling from Delaware to Washington, D.C. during his time in the Senate. But again, just all about that working class coalition that he's trying to win back. Because if you look at the polls, he's outperforming Hillary Clinton amongst African Americans. He's outperforming Hillary Clinton amongst white college-educated women. But he's underperforming right now, and President Trump is outperforming his 2016 levels amongst white working-class men. And so that's why I think the Biden campaign is feeling a bit emboldened to try to make inroads in constituencies that traditionally, based upon last cycle, the Democrats have struggled with.
Yeah, a lot of right there in Ohio. Thank you so much, Kevin. We look forward to hearing your reporting throughout the day and the night, I must say. That is Bloomberg's Kevin Cirilli, chief Washington correspondent. Well, all week this week, we're looking at Ohio as part of our swing state series leading up to the election. And it is no coincidence that the first debate tonight is taking place there, given how important Ohio has been in so many presidential elections. That's something Kyle Kondik of Sabato's Crystal Ball explained to us just yesterday.
For a long time, Ohio really, no state better reflected the national voting than Ohio did. Ohio typically voted a little bit more Republican than the nation, but not that much more. And Ohio also has voted for the winning electoral college candidate 29 of the last 31 elections. So going all the way back to 1896.
Okay, and now we welcome our Bloomberg political contributor, Rick Davis, and he is from Stone Court Capital. Rick, great to have you with us. Put together Ohio, if you can, with the broader question about what the nation's going to be seeing tonight. To what extent is it important that both of these candidates appeal to Ohio? Because to some extent, Ohio does represent what they need to do nationwide.
Well, it's a really good point that Ohio isn't necessarily included these days in a lot of the conversations around battleground states, because there are so many battleground states that are in play. But Ohio has always pulled pretty close between Trump and Biden, and the working class suburbs, like what Kevin Cirilli was just talking about, with the areas like Youngstown, is a real hotbed for Trumpism in the country, and so Trump's going to want to play there hard, and I think that tonight you'll see his message try to appeal not to the white suburban middle-class women that are in play in most of the states, but really to try and get his base rallied up amongst the blue-collar workers of Ohio.
And he's got several subjects he can choose from to go at that because we got a lot on the agenda. What is best for him? Is it the economy and the manufacturing jobs, something that he really embraced last time around? Is it his nominee to the Supreme Court or something else?
He's going to stress the manufacturing jobs. He's been doing that a lot on the campaign trail in places like Michigan and Pennsylvania, and will again tonight in Ohio. He wants to take credit for those things he was able to do in his administration. Regardless of whether there was a significant increase in manufacturing jobs, he's going to claim he's totally committed to it. The economy argument is a little stressed because of the downturn from the coronavirus. And so I think that he'll stay away from where we are today, but more talk about what he's been able to accomplish the first 2 years of his administration.
So, Rick, play it from the other side of the stage, as it were. What does Joe Biden need to keep the subject on?
Well, Joe Biden has his own jobs plan, and so he's not going to let Trump try to out-jobs create him. And so you'll see him out there arguing for that, too. But he's also going to say that the economy is in a shambles right now with almost 30 million people unemployed, and that he's got a plan to put them back to work. So I think he'll attack the jobs issue in a slightly different way. He will also spend a lot of time talking about the public health problems associated with COVID, and not just the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic, but our health system needs to be reinforced in order to support it. So you'll see him talking to suburban voters, especially about health care tonight.
I'd be a little surprised if there weren't at least some side crack about what happened with President Trump's taxes. But does Joe Biden have to resist the temptation to really spend a lot of time on that subject? Is that of real interest to the voters?
I think Joe Biden is going to have to spend an enormous amount of time resisting Donald Trump all night long. It's 90 minutes of Donald Trump. And if he can get a word in edgewise, it's going to be a success for him. But I think the key for the Biden camp is that they don't engage Trump and that they let Trump be Trump. But in the meantime, Biden communicates directly to the voters in his own style and substance. And so I think it's more like a candidate appearance where both are on the stage than a debate tonight.
Well, it's a fascinating point you make, Rick, actually, because if you look back through history of these debates, often it's the affect of the candidates more than actually the substance. The substance is there to get them engaged with one another, but it's what gestures they make, what their face looks like, when they sigh, they look at their watch, things like that. What is the affect that works best for Joe Biden tonight? We think we know what President Trump will look like.
Yeah, you're very right. I mean, we all remember Al Gore sighing. We remember George H.W. Bush looking at his watch, Sarah Palin winking. So it usually has nonverbal cues about how the night is going that's going to make some news. And it's hard to tell, right? I mean, Joe Biden may throw out a couple of technical points to reinforce the claim that he's not senile, which is what Donald Trump has been saying all month since the convention. So there's going to be a lot of opportunities for each of them to game out the night. But those things you usually can't tell until the next day what impact they're going to have.
We're all going to be watching that debate closely, and you'll be with us, of course, tonight. In the meantime, there's also some business maybe getting done, maybe not on Capitol Hill as they talk about maybe a fourth round of stimulus again. There's apparently some discussions going back and forth between Nancy Pelosi and Treasury Secretary Mnuchin. I really wonder, though, whether those two can get a deal done. We talked with Chuck Grassley, the senator from Iowa, last week, and he very specifically said the White House and Nancy Pelosi agreed on something, but he's got a problem with the Republican senators. This is what Chuck Grassley said.
This used to be the White House versus Pelosi up until about now. Now the president's coming in and saying we can maybe go to $1.5 trillion. He better be careful of that because I don't think that bill could get through the United States Senate.
So, Rick, is the biggest hurdle right now to getting a fourth round of stimulus, is it the White House or is it actually Republicans in the Senate?
Well, Senator Grassley knows his stuff, and I wouldn't doubt that he's got his ear to the floor of the Senate as to what Republicans are willing to take. I would say there are enough Republicans right now up for re-election in very tight races where they would join with the Democrats on a deal if the Trump administration and Nancy Pelosi agree. So as much as I agree that Republicans definitely want a smaller stimulus than what Nancy Pelosi's selling, if the Trump administration, Secretary Mnuchin, and Nancy Pelosi agree, I can't imagine a scenario where those Republicans who are up for re-election this year don't vote yes.
Okay, Rick, thank you so very much. That's Bloomberg contributor Rick Davis. And as I said, he's going to be part of our debate coverage. That's going to start tonight at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio. Coming up, one of the topics for the debate tonight will be race and violence in our cities. We talk with an expert on racial justice, Professor Monica Bell of Yale. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We turn now to Mark Crumpton for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, thank you. In our lead story of the day, President Trump and Joe Biden go head-to-head for the first time tonight in the opening presidential debate in Cleveland. Only a tiny fraction of voters say the debate's likely to change their minds. In a new poll from Monmouth University, 87% say they're not likely to be swayed on the debate. Only 3% say it's very likely. President Trump's sons are defending their father against the New York Times reporting that he avoided paying income tax. In separate interviews on Fox, Eric Trump and Donald Trump Jr. said their father's companies pay millions of dollars in payroll, real estate, and other taxes. They acknowledge that he has used depreciation, tax credits, and other provisions of the tax code to reduce his personal tax bill. The Times reported that Mr. Trump paid just $750 in federal income tax in 2016 and 2017 and paid no income tax at all in 10 of the previous 15 years, thanks to massive losses by his businesses. Boris Johnson's dismissing reports of concern among his Conservative Party colleagues that he has still not fully recovered from COVID-19. The British Prime Minister said today he is fitter than he was before when asked by the media about the rumors. The Prime Minister became seriously ill and required treatment in intensive care after testing positive for coronavirus in March. He spent about a month away from his duties at the peak of the UK's outbreak. A wildfire in Northern California's wine country has now more than tripled in size. The blaze has forced thousands of evacuations and is threatening properties in a region devastated by fires just 3 years ago. The fire is located north of San Francisco. It's burned more than 36,000 acres. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you very much, Mark. The deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor have led to months of protests and civil unrest, bringing to the fore once again the nation's struggle to overcome 400 years of racism and putting on the agenda for tonight's debate the subject of race and violence in our cities. We welcome now a student of the quest for racial justice. Monica Bell is Associate Professor of Law and of Sociology at Yale University and has written extensively on police reform and its deeper ties to segregation in our cities. So, Professor, thank you so much for being with us. As I said, this is specifically on the agenda for tonight, not a surprise given what's gone on in this country the last several months, but you've really studied this. What are the fundamental issues that need to be addressed, whether they will be or not on the debate stage tonight?
Sure. So one of the fundamental issues that we have to understand is that these problems of police racism and police violence and the experience of particularly Black communities, but not only Black communities with respect to policing in our nation, have very deep historical and structural roots. So we really need to hear solutions from the candidates that don't just run toward kind of training police officers out of kind of overt racism. We have to understand that these problems are baked into the fundamental structure of police departments. So we really need to see structural solutions that touch not just policing, but also multiple structures through which Black communities, especially, but also brown communities and other marginalized communities are oppressed and sort of left out of our democracy.
Yeah, no, but by and large, policing has been left to local government to handle, obviously with some issues in the federal level, but housing is different. And how much of what you're talking about is a housing issue, not just a policing issue?
So of course, these issues intersect. One of the challenges, as both a lawyer and a sociologist, is that the governance. First of all, the governance of both policing and housing operate on multiple levels. It is true that police governance is primarily local, and there are 18,000 plus police departments in our nation. But the federal government also has a massive role to play in the priorities of policing. Now, with respect to housing, the situation is somewhat more complicated, although a lot of decision making in terms of housing, fair housing, et cetera, are also quite local. So there are cooperative agreements between the federal government and state and local governments around housing. But it is true that historically, largely because of, for many reasons, through many different mechanisms, the establishment of HUD, the Fair Housing Act of 1968, but also, many kind of the massive federal housing infrastructure predating that, the federal government has long had a very serious role to play in housing and housing segregation. And in fact, the federal government set up segregated public housing. So there are distinctions, but I should say, one of the fundamental impulses of my work is not to see one problem as preceding the other. So you can't desegregate your way out of racially harsh policing, of course, but you also can't police your way around the persistence of housing segregation. So these are some of the so basically we have to operate on all of these issues at the same time and recognize that the deep interconnections between housing, education, policing, et cetera.
From your work, from your study, what do you expect, maybe even hope to hear from President Trump on the one hand and former Vice President Biden on the other? They seem to have quite different approaches to these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things that's been fascinating to me as a student of policing and federal policing policy during the Trump presidency is that really, we've seen over the past decade or so a greater embrace by people on the right of kind of recognizing the deep libertarian issues that emerge out of the policing and the criminal justice system. So there's a pretty massive embrace by people on the right of decarceration, of police reform, et cetera. And we had started to see that really that kind of a coalition emerging prior to the ascendance of President Trump, who has really taken, almost an anachronistic position with respect to law and order issues and with respect to policing. So actively encouraging police to be brutal toward people who they arrest, for example, and kind of receiving applause. And in some ways, he's really set back the conversation in police unions, et cetera, about what sorts of reforms would be accepted. And so I expect that we will see a strong defense of the status quo policing by President Trump, while also embracing other sorts of criminal legal system reforms.
And briefly, what do you hope to hear from Joe Biden?
Yeah, so what I hope to hear from Joe Biden is a deeper kind of a recognition that the problems of public safety we face in our nation are not problems that can be fixed by police alone.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor. It's really a pleasure to have you with us. I hope you come back. This is a much larger discussion we can have. That is Monica Bell. She's Associate Professor of Law at Yale Law School and Associate Sociology Professor as well at Yale. Still ahead, we're going to talk with Tom Perez, Chair of the Democratic National Committee, on the day of the big debate. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's time now to get a check on the markets, and that we turn to Scarlet Fu. not so great, not so bad.
Well, so much for the month-end rally that had been taking shape, because we're now looking at the S&P and Dow falling for the first time in 4 days. The Nasdaq also giving up some of its recent gains, too. It had just finished its best two-day advance since April. So the Nasdaq's relative outperformance today, its strength the last few days, is really a sign of some more defensive posturing. And the catalysts here are many, small but many. New York City's daily virus positive rate topped 3% for the first time in months, just as schools reopen. And of course, there's no movement on fiscal stimulus, even with Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin speaking this morning and committing to agree to speak some more tomorrow. Look, House Democrats released their latest action plan, $2.2 trillion package, much smaller than the $3.4 trillion HEROES Act that they passed. There's a lot more direct aid to taxpayers. You can see that $1,200 check, for instance. 20% of the plan will be earmarked for state and local governments, and this is a hard no for Republicans, and 10% for education. Few economists, David, are expecting any kind of deal to be struck before the election. So you saw JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs economists, for instance, cut their fourth quarter GDP forecasts as a result. Now, looking at the trading activity, it's fairly light before tonight's debate and before the big jobs report on Friday, which will be the last jobs report before the election on November 3rd. Energy is the worst performing group today and for the month, and this is as oil prices sink. They're now down below $40 a barrel, but if you look at a longer term chart for the year, for instance, you could see that pretty much it's been holding in a range and it's falling below its recent support. There's an increase in supply, Russia and Libya, right when concern is growing that demand will be slow to recover, given that European nations are talking about increasing travel restrictions.
So I noticed that financials are having a tough time with today, except for Square. What's going on with that?
Yeah, Square getting an upgrade here, and it's a financial type company. It's not in the S&P 500, it's in the Russell, but it's a financial payment services company that a lot of people thought would suffer in the wake of the pandemic. But Wolfe Research actually says that Square is gaining market share faster than before the pandemic because its Cash App, which is a sort of banking platform, is gaining a lot of ground, growing 46% in the second quarter, up from 22% in the first quarter. Cash App could be a real material beneficiary, David, from the pandemic, especially if more government stimulus is approved.
Okay, thank you so much to Scarlett Fu. In the meantime, there's some breaking news now. JP Morgan Treasuries, they lost money on that spoofing they've gotten penalized for. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's time now for First Word News, and for that we go to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. New York State is seeing an uptick in its coronavirus cases. Governor Andrew Cuomo says 20 zip codes across New York have an average positive test rate of about 5%. That's about 5 times the statewide average. The governor said today local governments must enforce compliance of social distancing guidelines and mask wearing. He also said, quote, "Our actions determine what happens." Governor Cuomo also said New York is not responsible for economic losses caused by the pandemic. Journalist Bob Woodward warns that Election Day could trigger a series of events in the United States. Woodward spoke with Bloomberg Television this morning.
My take on what's going to happen November 3rd is anything can happen. Trump can win, Biden can win. There can be total confusion and chaos for not just days, but maybe weeks, or God help us, longer, about who's going to be the next president.
Mr. Woodward recorded hours of interviews with President Trump for his latest bestseller, which is called Rage. The president's nominee for the Supreme Court is on Capitol Hill today. Amy Coney Barrett is meeting with Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and other key Republican senators in preparation for her fast-track confirmation hearing before the November 3rd election. Democrats warn that Barrett's nomination threatens the protections of the Affordable Care Act. Kentucky's Attorney General has agreed to release the recordings of the secret grand jury proceeding that considered charges against 3 officers involved in the fatal shooting of Breonna Taylor. Last week, the grand jury in Louisville issued charges against one of the officers for endangering Taylor's neighbors. None of the officers was charged in the killing of Miss Taylor, who was shot 5 times after officers knocked down her door to serve a narcotics warrant back in March. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. On Sunday, just 2 days before the debate tonight, taxes were back on the front pages of the nation's newspapers. This time, not because of the very different tax policies of the two candidates, but because of the New York Times report on President Trump's 2 decades of tax returns that it says shows he paid little or no taxes at all for most of the last 15 years. For an expert's opinion on what we're learning, we welcome now Stephen Rosenthal. He's senior fellow at the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center. Mr. Rosenthal has served as legislation counsel to the Joint Committee on Taxation and has spent some 25 years in Washington practicing tax law. So, Stephen, great to have you back with us. I took baby tax 100 years ago. I'm not a tax lawyer. Give me your response to the commonly made claim, this is what happens with rich real estate developers. You see tax returns like this. Is that right?
Well, thanks, David, for having me on. No, I don't think that's a fair characterization. I think Trump is an outlier. I mean, I've practiced for quite a long period of time, and I've never seen tax losses for such a sustained period. Trump generates tax losses, millions of dollars a year, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars a year. And the way he accomplishes that is really sort of baffling. It's a combination, as best I can figure out, of just being a staggering loser through his business operations, combined with aggressiveness at his tax planning. Very few people, in my experience, are as big a losers as he and as aggressive as he. And so I just haven't seen other taxpayers and other wealthy individuals who've managed to zero out their taxes for decades.
So, Stephen, give us a sense about tax accounting versus like cash in. Is it possible that President Trump was showing huge tax losses in a lot of these years when, in fact, he was making a lot of money by most of what we think of making in terms of the cash he was taking in that he could keep?
Well, a lot of Trump's losses are generated through borrowings and spending the borrowed money and taking deductions of other people's money. And so Trump's operations are often very leveraged, and he often throws off lots of losses, some of which are, accelerated depreciation and things of that sort, but more are just losing money. And the tax law generally requires taxpayers to reverse out their deductions, their losses for taxes, if the debt is forgiven. And Trump has managed to take the deductions at the front end and sidestep the income from forgiveness of debt at the back end. So while Trump is running his operations into the ground and taking large amounts of deductions, he manages to avoid picking up any income when his loans are forgiven, or any income or paying tax on the few operations that he has had that have been successful, the royalties from the apprenticeship program, for example.
Stephen, is it possible that, in fact, we are almost asking for this kind of behavior? That is to say, it's possible nothing he did was illegal, right? Is this really more an indictment of the tax code and how it's set up and the various loopholes and deductions, ways to get around things that we've set up?
Yeah, I think that's overstating the case, or perhaps blaming Congress too much. The world is a complicated place. Global transactions and structures of information technology and sharing and supply chains. It's very, very complicated. So tax laws are going to be complicated. And you're always going to have there always going to be some taxpayers who are going to try to exploit rules and stretch them beyond where they should fit. And so I would say that we're always going to have some problems. We're in a difficult situation now, though, because the IRS budget has been constrained. Resources are very poor. The IRS doesn't do a good job of auditing aggressive taxpayers. And even for outliers like President Trump, we need to have robust enforcement to make sure that the tax system does not erode and people become more and more aggressive. But I take your point. Congress could write rules that are simpler and easier to administer, but unfortunately, there's not much of a constituency for simplification, and there's lots of constituency and lobbying groups for complications and special provisions. But it's a combination of all these factors.
Well, it also brings us back to the debate tonight and the things that may get discussed on that debate stage. And President Trump, when he came to office, he made taxes one of his priorities. He certainly had a large tax cut, but he also talked originally about tax simplification, about tax reform. Remember, I think we were told we were going to be able to file our income taxes, most of us on like 1305 index card or something. Did we ever get to tax reform? Is there a route there for a candidate, Republican or Democrat, to really say we can improve the tax system fundamentally?
Well, I'm optimistic that there is a route, but unfortunately, I think it's going to take us having some real devastating restructuring of our economy first, and a demand for trying to do things right. So Trump's tax reform really was tax cuts for everybody, and I don't consider tax cuts for everybody reform. Unfortunately, it just dug us into a deeper and deeper hole, in my view. And there wasn't much simplification in anything Trump did. There was some elimination of deductions, like the SALT deductions for state and local taxes. And that simplified a little just by preventing people from listing and keeping track of their deductions, their state and local tax deductions. But that wasn't true simplification. That was just taking away things and choices from people who I think deserved a little more choice and a little more latitude.
Well, let's talk about that SALT tax, that state and local taxes, because it's a big issue, as you know, particularly in the Northeast. It's really hit New York, Connecticut, places like that very hard, New Jersey. Tell us, as a matter of tax policy, what's the rationale for it? Does it make sense to have the limitation on the deductions for state and local taxes?
Yes, so from my perspective, I think the limitations are wrong-headed. I wish that Congress had left in place the state and local tax deduction. And the reason I say that is because state and local tax deductions help states and localities fund their operations. They ask a lot from high-income taxpayers, and many of the services that they use the revenue to support are for low-income taxpayers. You know, Medicaid, schools, roads, welfare, and disproportionately use their revenues to help low-income taxpayers. However, it does benefit high-income taxpayers in the sense they get a deduction. That always struck me as rough justice and fair because that helps soften the blow. Those who object to the state and local tax deduction, which I do not, but those that do object say that the ones claiming the deduction are the highest income taxpayers. But in my view, since they're not getting the full benefit of their tax expenditures, it's going disproportionately to the lowest income taxpayers, we ought to offer them some relief. Just like we offer deductions for charitable contributions in the hope that high-income taxpayers will help support low-income taxpayers.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. Always great to have you with us on the subject of tax policy. That's Stephen Rosenthal. He is Senior Fellow at Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center. Coming up here, Tom Perez, Chair of the Democratic National Committee, comes to us from the site of the debate for his thoughts on what his candidate, Joe Biden, needs to deliver tonight. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. Tonight, the nation will get its first opportunity to see the two candidates for president, Donald Trump and Joe Biden, interacting with one another on a debate stage. For the view from the Democrat side, we welcome now Tom Perez. He is chair of the Democratic National Committee and former Secretary of Labor under President Obama. So, Secretary Perez, thank you so much for being with us. Give us your sense of what your man, Joe Biden, needs to get accomplished tonight.
I think Joe Biden's going to talk about his vision for America. How do we address these three crises we're confronting right now? The pandemic, the economic collapse, the civil rights challenges. The failures of this president are in stark contrast to Joe Biden's vision. He sees the world through the lens of Scranton, Pennsylvania. People in Scranton, people across America struggling to deal with the coronavirus, 200,000 deaths. This president has given up. Healthcare will be a big discussion tonight. You know, healthcare is on the ballot, David, as you know, on November 3rd, and it's on the ballot and it's on the docket of the Supreme Court on November the 10th. So there will be a lot of discussion about that. They want in the middle of a pandemic, Donald Trump wants to do away with coverage for people with pre-existing conditions. Joe Biden wants to do just the opposite, make sure that we address the pandemic, we expand access to health care coverage, we build back America better by investing in our human capital, by building an economy that works for everyone. These are the things that Joe Biden's going to talk about. They're just two diametrically different visions of America. Joe Biden believes that everybody should have a fair shake. Joe Biden believes that zip code should never determine destiny, and Joe Biden has people's backs. I'm here in Cleveland right now, and people in Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania, they remember that Barack Obama and Joe Biden saved the auto industry, and the Republicans wanted it to die.
Well,
and Donald.
Sorry, Secretary, I was just going to say that leads me exactly to the question. I know that Joe Biden wants to appeal to every single American, but who's his core audience? Is it, as you just suggested, maybe the manufacturing workers in places like Ohio and in Michigan and in Wisconsin, places like that? Or is it particularly women in the suburbs around Cleveland, for example, and Dayton and Cincinnati? Who's his core target audience tonight?
Well, I think that Joe Biden has said, I want to be the president for everyone. He is the uniter in chief. Joe Biden's vision for America, when you talk about addressing the COVID crisis in a real way, that's talking to everyone, because COVID doesn't discriminate. COVID has touched so many people. It has actually disproportionately touched communities of color, but it doesn't discriminate in the sense that everybody has been affected in one way, shape, or form by COVID. And so when Joe Biden is talking about how to address the COVID crisis, he's speaking to everyone. When he's talking about health care, there are so many people with pre-existing conditions, Republicans, Democrats, independents, white, non-white, urban, rural, suburban. These are the issues that he's speaking about. There are so many people right now who want a leader who can bring us together. And when I'm sitting here in a state where Sherrod Brown, a very progressive Democrat, and John Kasich, the former Republican governor of the state of Ohio, both support Joe Biden. And so I bring that up because it really illustrates that Joe Biden, his coalition is very diverse and it's growing.
Yeah, and it's important you bring that up for another reason as well. As we know, Ohio is very key in presidential races, particularly for the Republicans. Basically, no Republicans ever won the presidency without winning Ohio. What are the chances that Joe Biden can win in Ohio? There was a SurveyMonkey poll out there reported by Politico just today that had him down 7 points. What are you seeing?
Well, the polls that actually have the most rigor have had this as a dead heat. The last 2 or 3 polls that were out that I saw had Biden up 2, which is, again, that's a margin of error jump ball race. And again, when you have Donald Trump came into Ohio multiple times, David, and said there will never be a plant closure. There will never be a plant closure. Those are not my words. Those are Donald Trump's words. And voters here in Ohio remember that it was Barack Obama and Joe Biden that saved the auto industry, and Donald Trump lied. You go to Lordstown, Ohio, and ask the people who used to work at the Chevy plant. Remember, Donald Trump told you don't sell your homes? Well, guess what? They have to sell their homes right now. Joe Biden will keep his promise. His North Star are people in Youngstown and Toledo and Cleveland and Scranton and those industrial Midwestern places. And that's why he's doing well here.
Secretary Perez, I want to sneak in one that's not tied to the presidency, but to the Senate race, and particularly South Carolina Lindsey Graham, because we do have this appointment, this nomination now of Amy Coney Barrett, which is pretty controversial. And I read today that perhaps it was helping Lindsey Graham's opponent raise funds. Is the DNC putting money into that race? What is it looking like to you?
Well, that's another dead heat race. And I know Jamie Harrison very well. Jamie Harrison has something that Lindsey Graham lacks: integrity. And what's really interesting about that race is the former, I think, CEO of Michelin, who used to be the finance chair for Lindsey Graham, is one of Jamie Harrison's strongest supporters. and he cut an ad for Jamie Harrison that said, Jamie Harrison is someone whose word you can trust. We need people in South Carolina, folks have said, who's going to put the interests of South Carolina first. Lindsey Graham has become a lackey for Donald Trump. His absence of integrity. Look what he said in 2016 about the nomination of Merrick Garland. You can quote me, don't in a presidential campaign year, you should let the people decide. Those are Lindsey Graham's words, and now 4 years later, those words are out the window.
Yeah, in fact,
voters want integrity in their leaders.
Yeah, I think he said, actually, you can use my words against me. But that raises...
Thank you. You're right, Dave. I stand corrected.
It raises another issue, though. He's going to have a very big platform, Lindsey Graham is, Senator Lindsey Graham, as they have these confirmation hearings. And last time it didn't hurt him much when he really took a very strong stance with respect to then Judge, now Justice Kavanaugh. Is there some advantage for Lindsey Graham because he's really going to get a nationwide stage for at least 4 days of hearings?
Well, and during those 4 days, we're going to talk about how health care is on the ballot on November 3rd, and health care is literally on the docket of the Supreme Court November the 10th. And back in 2017, a guy named John McCain had the courage to cast a deciding vote that saved the Affordable Care Act. Remember, that used to be Lindsey Graham's good buddy. Now Lindsey Graham is here trying to do away with access to health care, because make no mistake about it, they're trying to ram this nomination through because they want to undo the Affordable Care Act. An oral argument in the Supreme Court is on November the 10th. Voters are going to see for those 4 days that health care indeed is on the ballot. And if they have a pre-existing condition, they better be worried, because Lindsey Graham wants to lead the effort to do away with that coverage. I welcome that conversation.
Mr. Secretary, it's really great to have you. Good luck tonight in that debate. That's Tom Perez. He is DNC chair. Tune in tonight for our special coverage of the presidential debate. That kicks off at 8:30 p.m. in New York time. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. New York City has posted a daily coronavirus positive test rate of over 3%. That's for the first time in months now. Governor Andrew Cuomo has been speaking about that problem. Let's get more now from Bloomberg's Michael McKee. So this was not good news for New York City, Mike.
Not good news for New York City, although the mayor of New York City, Bill de Blasio, and the governor, Andrew Cuomo, say it is a containable problem. What they found is in 9 zip codes, and there's 146 of them in the New York City area, and there's a trivia question for you, David, that I didn't realize.
I didn't either.
There has been a spike in cases, and many of these cases are religious communities, and they are tying many of these cases to the religious schools in those areas. And so they are making a concerted effort to send in test and trace people and to try to get people in those areas to socially distance and wear masks. And if they can, that would bring down the caseload. The rest of the state still around 1%, and the 7-day moving average is just over 1%, and it's the 7-day moving average that counts in terms of whether or not you would close the schools under the system they've set up here in New York City. So the schools are not closing. As a matter of fact, today's the first day for many kids, and they are open for the time being.
Well, that's what I was going to say. It's a pretty unfortunate day to have this happen because there's been so much trepidation about opening up those schools and on that day to get this number coming through. But what are they doing? You said they were urging people to wear masks and socially distance, things like that. But we're doing special testing for those specific targeted areas? Are we going in with public health officials? How are we going to put a stop in those specific zip codes?
They're doing a whole lot of different things. Of course, many of these neighborhoods are Orthodox neighborhoods. They've been sending around loudspeaker trucks in Yiddish to tell people to wear masks. They're sending in test and trace people. And the mayor said today they are going to start imposing fines on people who are not wearing masks. The first thing, in theory, a police officer will do is hand you a mask. And if you refuse to put it on, they can fine you. They didn't specify how much.
Yeah, at the same time, Governor Cuomo was also talking about the losses, the economic losses from lack of revenue, really addressing the question of stimulus.
Yes, and this is a big battle between Andrew Cuomo and Donald Trump and the state of New York and the Trump administration, and not just the state of New York, but the administration has been very much against a large payout to states for COVID reimbursements. They see it as some of the money being used for things like pension funds shortfalls and things like that. Cuomo said today that he's going to take this fight to Trump and that he expects that if the president loses, and especially if Democrats take over the Senate, the problem will be solved. If not, they're going to have to do a lot more work. New York City itself faces about a $13.5 billion shortfall, which the mayor said could result in 22,000 layoffs.
Wow.
Cuomo said if they got to that point, he'd send in the National Guard to help pick up the garbage.
Wow, not good news. Okay, thank you so much to Bloomberg's Michael McKee. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to talk with Democratic Senator from Delaware, Chris Coons. This is Bloomberg.